Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your kind introduction. And I would like to thank to Barakat Trust for giving me the opportunity to be here at KRC. And I would like to send my special thanks to Michael Atkinson, who has generously created the 3D models that you will see in a few moments. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for being here. And I hope you will enjoy your time despite my English. I will talk about, as Jeremy also said, I will talk about a part of my current research on the building activities of Gülnuş Sultan. And I will focus on a certain building of her, which is located in today's Istanbul in Galata. Therefore, I will now take you to Istanbul. As you stroll through the streets of Istanbul, just like many other historic cities around the world, you pass by many ancient buildings. That's quite normal. But you may even step a certain land where a monument used to stand, but then has almost been forgotten as years pass by, and even new buildings might be present on that spot. However, there is a certain spot in Galata, near the shores of Golden Horn, where two historic buildings used to stand. The first one was San Francisco Convent. It was first built in the early 13th century and rebuilt several times until its final demolition in 1696, and functioned as the main Catholic church of the whole city for more than 2 centuries. The second one was Galata New Mosque. It was built on the ruins of that church in 1698 by Gülnuş Sultan, but finally demolished in the 20th century. Interestingly, these buildings are almost forgotten, both by ordinary people and by the academe as well. What is more interesting is that this mosque was intentionally built on the land of that church to reshape the religious and demographic character of Galata. Because it was the turbulent years after the Battle of Vienna, and this replacement was a substitution for the Ottoman defeats taken on the battlefields. Still interestingly, the economic and social constraints had shaped the architecture of the mosque, which was extraordinarily modest, although it was a Sultanate mosque. You can barely see the other Sultanate mosques crowning the hills of the historic peninsula, all of which have the domes and multi-minarets, but the Galata New Mosque had only one minaret, and it had a hipped roof, not a dome. Yet more weirdly, this mosque was abandoned to its fate to gradually decay in the early 20th century, and it was finally replaced by a hardware market. Hence, in this seminar, I aim to reveal the forgotten history of Galata Yeni Cami and to revitalize its unusual architecture by offering an architectural reconstruction. To realize this aim, I used the following sources, mainly the Ottoman archives, Prime Minister Ottoman Archive and Topkapı Palace Museum Archive in Istanbul, and the Vakfiyas from Directorate General of Foundations Archive in Ankara, as well as travelogues, chronicles, historical maps, drawings, and rare photographs. And now let me give you the contents of my presentation. I will start with a historical background. I will talk about the Latin in Galata and San Francisco Church firstly. Then I will tell you narrate the construction of Galata New Mosque with the available documents in hand. Then I will give the answer how it disappeared, and then I will focus on the architecture of the building, followed by the reasons of its unusual architecture, and I will conclude with the Islamization of the Catholic land in Galata. Okay, let's get started. Galata was a neighborhood of the Byzantine Constantinople, but it became an attraction point during the Latin occupation between 1204 and 1261. During the Latin occupation, two important churches were built. The one on the left is San Paul and San Domenico Church, commonly known as the Arab Mosque today. And the other one was San Francisco Church, which was replaced by Galata New Mosque later. The Genoese started to settle down in Galata after the Latin occupation, and they constructed Galata walls, parts of which you can see here. And they built new churches. Some of them are seen here, as well as others. And they also made some extensions to the remaining available churches. The Genoese handed the keys of Galata to Mehmed II after the siege of Constantinople in 1453 by signing a treaty and saved their churches in return. However, later, those churches started to change hands or they were replaced by other buildings. For example, the major church of Galata, San Paolo and San Domenico, was converted into a mosque in the last years of the reign of Mehmed II and then handed over to Moriscos coming from Granada, hence gaining the name Arab Mosque. After this conversion, San Francisco Church became de facto cathedral of Galata, Istanbul, and the Franciscan abbot of this monastery had also become the leader of the Catholics. Henceforth, this building started to be affected by the fluctuations of Ottoman-Catholic relationship. For instance, this is funny, as Christians were considered to be liable of the approaching doomsday by the Islamic authorities, San Francisco Church was closed down in 1585. The church stayed closed until 1597 and could only be opened by the negotiation of the ambassador of the French King Henry IV. Another factor that improved the importance of San Francisco Church was its architecture and outer ornamentation. Clavijo, who had visited Constantinople in 1403, states that the building is magnificent and richly ornamented, while Evliya Çelebi, the famous 17th century traveler, remarks that it has a high four-cornered bell tower and there are strange and weird pictures on the walls of its interior and exterior. Those weird pictures could be seen on the splendid facades of the church if we closely investigate these drawings, which I took from Gualberto Mettoici's monograph that reveals the history and architecture of San Francisco Convent. There were figural representations on the doors, which were admired by both Catholic and Muslims, as seen above. And the interiors of the church and the chapels were also adorned with mosaics and paintings, as well as tombstone monuments. San Francisco was located near the market and close to the marina. This side is the Golden Horn. And half of its accompanying convent was lying on the hill. This side is a slopey area and on the hill, and this side is lying on the plain. Besides the main church of San Francisco, here, there were two adjoining cloisters, the sacristy and the bell tower was located here, and other buildings, as well as the St. Anne Chapel and gardens. And the San Francisco Church was a single-naved basilica with a large rectangular apse to the east of it, with two flanking chapels on both sides. However, this remarkable building was burned down to its foundations in 16 1639, and since the Ottoman state was not in favor of its rebuilding, it stayed in ruins until it was hardly rebuilt as a smaller church. This sketch shows us the situation of San Francisco convent after the fire, and the new smaller church was built just next to the old one. The first cloister of the convent formed the nave of the new church with surrounding chapels, while the old sacristy was transformed into the high altar. Nevertheless, another fire in 1660 destroyed this building, like many others in Galata. However, upon the conquest of Heraklion in 1669, after the long Cretan War and the re-establishment of relationships with Venetians, a permit for the reconstruction of the church was given. Newly built San Francisco Church reopened in 1670 under the safekeeping of the Venetians, but not this one, a new one. The last act of the history of San Francisco opened on 6 May 1696 with yet another fire in Galata, devastating many buildings in the neighborhood besides San Francisco Church. After the unsuccessful siege of Vienna in 1683, the relationship of Ottomans with the Catholics had been irreversibly retrograded, and Ottomans have had heavy defeats from the Holy League since then. On the other hand, hostility towards non-Muslims, formulated and popularized by the Kadizadeli movement in the 17th century, had probably become even more radical. Therefore, the ruins of the church and the accompanying buildings of this convent were seized upon the decree of Mustafa II in 1697, and Gülnuş Sultan built Galata New Mosque on its site. French traveler de la Meurtrier, who has witnessed the construction of the mosque during his stay in Istanbul, explains the replacement of the church as follows. The Italians of this order had a very large and pretty handsome one, dedicated to their patron St. Francis, which was, as it were, the parish church for the Roman Catholics of Galata for some ages. But this being destroyed by fire, and the Turks of Galata having remonstrated to the Porte that these monks had made a tavern of their convent, the ground was taken possession of to build a mosque, which was not yet finished when I arrived there. And word was sent to the monks that the fire having destroyed and purified a place of scandal and abomination, the Porte would raise upon it a building of purity and piety. Another French traveler, Tournefort, who had seen Galata New Mosque in 1700, just after its completion, relates, Franciscan priests were performing their jobs in Galata for 4 centuries. However, their church was converted to a mosque after the fire. Franks call this mosque the Saint Francois Mosque, and the Turks call it the Valide Mosque, due to the present Queen Mother, who has contributed to the rebuilding of it. The church was lost purely by the fault of the Italian monks, who lived an irregular life. They were selling wine and brandy at their houses, the kind of trade what the Turks hate the most. They wrote on the foundation inscription that they have transformed a place of scandal and infamy into a house of God. Wow. The Vakfiyah, or the endowment deed of the mosque, also emphasizes that the church, which used to be the home of deviant paintings and idolatrous people, was cleared off by the vitriol rage of the god. When all those quotations are taken into account, it can be thought that religious reasons were more predominant for the replacement of San Francisco Church by Galata New Mosque. However, I claim that the political milieu could well have been a triggering reason for the conversion of this church, which was under the possession of Venetians with whom the Ottomans were in war then. In fact, contemporary chronicler Silahtar Mehmet Ağa underlines that even the permit for rebuilding other churches was given, the Venetian church was pulled down. Therefore, we can draw the conclusion that it was a combination of reasons that paved the way for the replacement. As a result, the land was expropriated and the Mosque of Gülnuş Sultan was constructed on the very spot. Before continuing with the history of this mosque, I think it will be better to make a detour to learn who is this Gülnuş Sultan. Gülnuş Emetullah Sultan was the Haseki, i.e. the favorite wife of Mehmet IV and mother of two Ottoman sultans, Mustafa II and Ahmet III. She was born around 1640 in Retimno, on the island of Crete, of a Greek origin from the Verzidze family, and brought to harem as a concubine. In 1646, she attracted the young Sultan Mehmet IV and became his favorite after giving birth to Şehzade Mustafa. Her precious position in the eye of Mehmet IV elicited her participation in the campaigns and hunting parties of the Sultan. She even gave birth to his second son, Şehzade Ahmet, during a campaign. She later became Valide Sultan, i.e. Queen Mother, upon her elder son Mustafa II's ascent to the throne in 1695. She also occupied this rank during his younger son Ahmet III's reign until her death in Edirne in 1715. Apart from this mosque in Galata, she built extensively throughout the Ottoman Empire, as you can see on this map. Similar to previous Ottoman royal women's patronage, Gülnuş Sultan was not only building for herself, but also in the name of the state and in the name of her sons. Moreover, architectural patronage in return was providing her a reputation and visibility among her subjects, just like other Ottoman women, whose access to public space was restricted. After this detour, I will give you a brief timeline to summarize the events related with San Francisco Church to see what had happened since its construction in the early 12th century until its demolition in the late 17th century. Now, it's time to focus on the construction of Galata New Mosque. Well, it will be very difficult to comment on the construction of a non-extant building, especially if it had disappeared long ago, leaving little material clues behind. Luckily, several invaluable documents have survived in the Ottoman archives, and they shed light on the construction process of Galata New Mosque and help substantially to understand many aspects of its architecture. The document of reconnaissance survey dated to 28th of September 1696, almost 5 months after the fire and before the decree of Mustafa II for the seizure of the land of the convent, was apparently drawn up to supply advanced information to the patron for the intended construction. Regarding the date of this document, and keeping in mind that Mustafa II was away from Istanbul for a military expedition, it can safely be claimed that this survey was demanded by Gülnuş Sultan, and this shows that it was her own will to replace the burnt down convent with her mosque. This document was issued by Chief Royal Architect Mehmet Ağa, and we can see his seal and signature here, and the architect of these non-extant buildings becomes clear with this. The survey gives the estimated expenses for the construction of the mosque here, and as well the probable spolia from the convent ruins: 8 medium-sized columns, 31 small columns, and 9 iron beams. They were also listed as available in the construction site and excluded from the reconnaissance cost. Then the cost of the available stone, brick, and iron materials from the ruins were also noted down as can be reused after the demolition. a much more valuable statement appears in the following lines of this document. It reads, "The plan and roofing of this mosque upon the decree was designated to be similar to Arab mosque. Arab mosque, aforementioned converted Latin church with a heaped roof and being the oldest shrine of the neighborhood only 200 meters away from Galata New Mosque, apparently constituted a visual prototype for this new mosque. In fact, this piece of information is very valuable in two ways, as it highlights two important phenomena. Firstly, it is understood that the requested outline and roofing of the mosque is ordered to the chief royal architect with a formal decree, obviously by the Queen Mother in the absence of the Sultan, who was away from the capital, even before the destruction of the convent in the fire. For Ottoman architectural historians who have kept doubting the intervention of the patrons in the design of buildings, this statement once again clearly shows that the patron was directly involved in the planning of the mosque. Secondly, it can be deduced that this request of Gülnuş Sultan shows the sensitiveness of the Ottomans to the proportions and regularity of the present built environment. Even though all previous Sultanate mosques in Istanbul were domed, this one followed the model of a nearby ancient building. However, this request might also be a result of other constraints, which I will discuss shortly. Yet another document, the building register, supplies invaluable data for this building enterprise, as it gives the kinds and prices of every single material used in the construction. From the dates given in the register, we learn that they are written here. It's very small, we cannot read it now. It's written that the construction was started on 23rd of April 1697 and finished by 10th of July 1698, and it took 15 months. The dates on the inscription panels of the mosque gives the completion date year as after Hijra 1109, and it is coherent with this date. In this document, the money paid for each part of the land and for the ruins is listed. And this document also gives a comprehensive list of costs of each material used in the construction. It gives the wages of workers and overseers, and expenses made for the inner decoration of the mosque, and expenditures for the construction of the waterways. When these tables are examined thoroughly, important material clues are obtained for this non-existent building, which could be used for the architectural reconstruction. It is even possible to make some deductions for the materials not listed in the register. For example, no tiles were used in the mosque, in the construction of the mosque, or in the decoration. And this could be attributed to a financial difficulty related with the period, or the decay of the tile workshops in Iznik, or a change of taste after the extreme use of tiles in the previous 17th century mosques in Istanbul. Although the mosque was completed and open to prayer in Hijri year 1109, the furnishing of the Sultan's pavilion and platform in the mosque was delayed and probably finished just before the official launch, which was possibly postponed as the Sultan and the Queen Mother were out of Istanbul since the completion of the construction. After the final touch-ups for the Sultan's pavilion, the mosque was ready for the official launch on 26th of September 1699. Gülnuş Valide Sultan invited her son Mustafa II to the opening ceremony, and after the Friday prayer, bequeathed him an adorned horse and jeweled belt. Nevertheless, Constructions related with the mosque continued in the following years, with several additions and repairs during the tenure of Gülnuş Sultan. Silahtar Mehmet Ağa relates that a stroke of lightning had hit the mosque on 7th of September 1700, and the minaret had collapsed down until its base, and the walls of the mosque had cracked from one side to another. The repair was carried out just after the lightning stroke, together with the enlargement of the mosque courtyard and relocation of the latrines. Because two vacant lands next to the mosque had been bought in order to add them to the courtyard, and the latrines were moved to a more appropriate place away from the mosque. I was very happy when I found this document because I had learned that the lightning stroke has hit the mosque in the aforementioned date, and then I found the repair of the minaret and the other parts, and I think it was one of the most happy moments of my research. Gülnuş Sultan's Chamberlain, Ketüda Mehmet Efendi, who was responsible for closely taking care of all of her building activities, had written a letter to her just after this repair and enlargement, and summarized the building process of the mosque, starting from the expropriations as follows. The land of the church was used appropriately according to the plan drawn in the beginning in order to build the mosque, ablution fountains, and latrines. And the lands acquired before and recently around the mosque were added to its courtyards. Those lands belonged either to Muslims or Christians or Jews, and they were not seized without their landowner's will. They argued that they were not in favor of selling their lands cheaply, since this is a sultanate mosque. Thank God those lands were bought gradually and with the will of their owners. In the following years, even more land was acquired around the mosque in order to construct houses for the dwelling of the imams of the mosque and for renting to have income for the waqf. Firstly, 2 houses were built near the mosque for the imams. Then 7 two-storied houses as well as 2 cellars were constructed adjacent to the mosque for rent. However, Ketüda Mehmet Efendi's words in another letter, which could be dated to circa 1706, indicates that the neighborhood around the mosque was still dominantly non-Muslim even after 8 years of its construction. He addressed to Gülnuş Sultan's complaint about non-Muslim houses and ships surrounding her mosque in Galata, but could not refute this argument. Instead, he claimed that the mosque congregation was so much that it was the second after Hagia Sophia, apparently an exaggeration. However, Gülnuş Sultan's complaint could be interpreted as her intention of a religious transformation around her mosque. In other words, Islamization of the land. In the same year, Ketüda Mehmet Efendi built a Hadith medrese and primary school to the east of the Gülnuş Sultan Mosque, here. Although these buildings' construction costs were met by him, he asked for Gülnuş Sultan's financial support for the operating expenses, and she granted the salaries of the attendants from her waqf. After the attachment of a second fountain in 1708, here, and with the attachment of this fountain, the buildings of Ketüda Mehmet Efendi, the primary school and the Hadith Madrasa, has become linked with the rest of the complex, and it had become literally a complex, a mosque complex, let me say. And this Islamic complex was a bolder affirmation of the above-mentioned intention of religious transformation. Now, I will tell you how did it disappear. Galata New Mosque seen several repairs and renovations throughout its history after the lifetime of Gülnuş Sultan. An extensive repair and rebuilding was carried out in 1821 since since the roofing, the Sultan's pavilion, and other elements were in need of restoration. It is highly probable that the difference in the roofing and projecting parts seen between these images, if we closely investigate these parts, they are slightly different. And you can also check the dates of those drawings and photographs. It is highly probable that the difference in the roofing and projecting parts seen between these images was due to this repair, and Galata New Mosque gained its final appearance seen in later photographs. Another repair in 1892 was probably the last restoration of the building. Then, through the end of its life, its accompanying elements have been used for other purposes. The mosque's courtyard was used as the bazaar area for Thursday market, Perşembe Pazarı, after 1874. The portico and rooms of the mosque was used to shelter military officers around 1902. Two houses allocated to imams were both to be used as police station, but they were used as the horse barn of Ottoman Bank around 1906. And in 1913, the sales of those two houses was approved by the Office of Mufti, and this implies that the building has lost its main function as a mosque, certainly before this date. Although its roof was dismantled for a restoration around 1908, the consecutive wars of 1910s interrupted these efforts and left the building in a vulnerable position of gradual decay. After being left intact for several decades, it became almost a wreck in 1930s. Indeed, the mosque could be observed as healthy and steady in the photographs of the late 19th century, whereas later photographs of early 20th century show it with its half-ruined minaret. On the maps drawn in the early years of Republic of Turkey, the land is described as ruined new mosque. Moreover, this document, dating from 1937, certificates the sale of this land as a means of income for Directorate General of Foundations. And as you can see, the sales was approved by President Kemal Atatürk, and the opposition of the mayor of Istanbul could not save even the greenery. Finally, in 1957, the remaining ruins of the mosque were demolished in order to make room for a brand new hardware market, and this store was opened in 1960 by the Prime Minister Adnan Menderes. Since 1960, the store occupies the land with its shops aligned perpendicular to Qibla direction. This is the Qibla direction, and these are perpendicular to it. And this implies that the foundations of the mosque were used in the construction of those shops. Well, let me give you another timeline which summarizes the history of the Galata New Mosque from its construction in 1698 till its replacement by this brand new hardware market. And you can see the important dates. This is an extensive repair, probably reshaped the royal pavilion of it. And we can also see that the building lost its main function as a mosque in early 20th century. Having said that, I will continue with the architecture of Galata New Mosque. In order to visualize Galata New Mosque, which once stood on the site now occupied by the hardware market, it is essential to consult historic maps, old drawings, and rare photographs. However, most of those images supply a limited outer view of the building since they were taken from afar and the building only forms a small part of the landscape of Galata. Nevertheless, A group of photos that you've seen on the screen, and those were from glass negatives. And I discovered them in the archives of Istanbul Archaeological Museum. And they were taken in 1930s, just before the demolition of Galata New Mosque. And they give invaluable information about the interior and exterior of the building, and it also allows us to make a partial architectural reconstruction. Moreover, surviving elements of the complex that I discovered in the fieldwork helps this reconstruction. Probably I am the only one who saw those stone pieces. I used a ladder to climb up to the roof. And this is the back side of the hardware market. And I can show you the location of those in here, just here. We also have a blocked gateway of the mosque. This is the photo from the Istanbul Archaeological Museum's archive, and this is the recent situation. This is the second fountain added to the mosque in 1708, and as you can see, it's blocked and it's almost invisible. I just had to carry all these plastics to the left to take this photo. And of course we have, this is the location of that gate. And of course we have two surviving fountains from the mosque. The one on the left is to the south of the mosque, and the one on the right is to the east of it. And you can see the locations of them on this map. The ablution fountains attach to the water reservoir were attached to the northern wall of the courtyard here. Those are the places of the ablution fountains. Two houses allocated to imams and were possibly located on each side of the western gate inside the courtyard. 7 houses might have been, this is a probability, we are not quite sure about that, might have been located to the north of the courtyard. The latrines must have occupied to the northwestern corner, because we learned that they were carried the far side of the courtyard. And I would like to show you the gates of the mosque. There were 5 gates. This was the main gate, because on this gate we have the building inscription just above the arch. And this inscription, the poem on this inscription, conveyed the message that Valide Sultan's mosque had become the place of Muslims and close to God, though this spot used to be the place of idols and icons before. And this message was repeated several times, both in the writings of the travelers and in the Vakfiyah. And after the inspection of these elements surrounding the mosque, now an architectural description of Galata New Mosque could be offered. The only plan of the mosque was drawn by Cornelius Gurlitt, and he writes that the mosque was a wooden flat-roofed quadrangle with a wooden portico and a minaret next to it. However, this plan carries some inconsistencies with the German blue map and the available photos. Therefore, a more accurate plan could be offered like this one. The mosque had a rectangular prayer hall, which is 24 meters in width and 19 meters in length. And the portico of it was approximately 5 meters, 4.6 meters to be accurate. And it can be suggested that the door entered after climbing side stairs was leading to another door, another stairs, which leads to the second floor, so the Sultan's pavilion. In fact, the traces of these staircases are visible To the left of, it's barely visible here, to the left of, and you can't see it here again, to the left of this door. And the royal pavilion must have encompassed the whole upper level of the projecting parts, as well as an oriel visible in this photo. This is the oriel, and this is the Sultan's pavilion, and we can assume that the Sultan's pavilion encompassed all these projecting areas. But we cannot be 100% sure about that. However, the rectangular narrow windows of the pavilion seen on the photographs hint that it was renovated in the 19th century, probably during the extensive restoration of 1821. And you can see the difference once more in this slide. So this is before the restoration of 1821, and this is after the restoration of 1821. The difference between the roofing can be traced on those plans. It is seen from this photograph that the portico of the mosque was elevated on a sub-basement, and there was an entrance door to the basement to the right of it. Adjacent to the mosque and access through a door to the right end of the portico stood thin cylindrical minaret with its square base. I will go back to the plan. This is the minaret, and this is the entrance to it. Yeah. After climbing double-sided stairs here, one can reach the portico, and you can enter the mosque through this main gate, because the inscription panel is mounted on top of it. This makes it the main gate. And this is a closer photo of it, which is from the same archive. And the marble foundation inscription of this mosque was in another museum, the Türk İnşaat ve Sanat Eserleri Müzesi, and it was taken there after the demolition of the mosque. Similar to other inscription, the one that I showed you previously, this also conveys the message of the conversion of the place of idols into the place of God by the generosity of the Sultan. Another photograph gives the interior view of the mosque with piled up wooden beams, which were most probably used in the roofing and timber portico of the mosque. There were two levels of windows, and there was a mukarnas niche mihrab positioned at the center of the Qibla wall. The mihrab seen here was originally a niche decorated with mukarnas and bordered by moldings, but it was covered with plaster to form a round niche, and a Kaaba figure was painted on it, certainly in a 19th century renovation. The minbar was placed to the right of the mihrab between two windows, but only the trace of it is visible in this photograph, but not the minbar. The simple architecture of the mosque with a heaped roof, a single minaret, and modest outer view probably decreased the interest of artists and photographers who had illustrated other Sultanate mosques widely. Accordingly, this elicited the lack of visual images to be used for a true reconstruction of the building. It was a pity that there were neither interior pictures of it nor close-up outer ones in the research archives. Even so, a partly hypothetical architectural reconstruction could be offered with some assumptions. We collaborated with Michael Atkinson. I supplied the available data from the maps, archival documents, and photographs, and he created these lovely models. But I should note that we had to make some assumptions when the data was not available. Moreover, all the data used to render the building depicts the final phases of the mosque after several repairs and additions, but not completely its original form during the tenure of Gülnuş Sultan. Now, I will come to the reasons of this unusual architecture. Besides its complicated history, one of the interesting issues about Galata New Mosque is its strangely modest architecture. Having a heaped roof rather than a large and high dome sitting on pillars, it looked quite simple and compared to previous Queen Mother's buildings, and it deviates from the decorum rules formalized by architects known in the 16th century, as it looks like a mosque of a lower rank rather than a sultanate mosque. In fact, contemporary observer Turnefo also underlines this by comparing Gülnuş Sultan's mosque with its namesake, which was built by Hatice Turhan Sultan across the Golden Horn, and he claims that Gülnuş Sultan has simply converted the Franciscan church in Galata into an ordinary mosque. Moreover, if Eminönü New Mosque's splendid Sultan's pavilion and its lavishly decorated interior with tiles are taken into account, Galata New Mosque seems even simpler, and under these circumstances, an architectural comparison of these namesake mosques would be lopsided. Then, what could be the reason of this unusual architecture? Reconsidering the historical circumstances once more would likely to yield insights about this. First of all, the turbulent period after the Battle of Vienna and defeats taken in the War of the Holy League since 1683 were catastrophic for the Ottomans in many aspects, as well as economically. However, Hatice Turhan Sultan had the chance of a better economic and political circumstances for constructing her mosque in 1660s. In addition, she had used the argument of establishment of a Jewish quarter with well-paid expropriations, which would make her building enterprise an approved one. Therefore, she was able to build a large complex with a domed mosque with 2 minarets. Even if Gülnuş Sultan had her own budget enough to build a similar grand-scale mosque, both ulema and her subjects would not have been pleased with this under given economic and political conditions, and this might even have paved the way of her, or rather her son's end. Therefore, she probably opted for building a smaller mosque without a dome and with only 1 minaret, which was apparently much more inexpensive and modest. Yet more speculation could be carried out regarding the possible effect of Kadızadeli movement, which was against unnecessary and flamboyant mosque construction, especially with more than 1 minaret. The Kadızadeli Mehmet Efendi even had claimed that the other minarets of the mosque should be put down. This 1 minaret is enough. As the doctrines of Şeyhülislam Feyzullah Efendi, an important figure of Kadızadeli sect, was quite influential during the reign of Mustafa II. Consulting the above discussed archival documents may even supply rationale for the unusual architecture. The building of a heaped roof mosque with a layout similar to nearby Arab mosque had been requested with a degree, probably by the patron and for the sake of being consistent with the present built environment of Galata. Therefore, this demand, possibly shaped by present conjecture, must have dictated the architect's plan. Moreover, the inadequate space for construction might have restricted building in larger scale, since the L-shaped and sloping land, which was expropriated gradually from the landowners and making the initial area even smaller than the final one, was inappropriate if the constraint of orientation towards Qibla is also taken into account. In fact, this is the location of the later San Francisco church, and this map is the first San Francisco church, and the church was not here when it was replaced by the mosque, and it was here. So the mosque literally built on its site. As a result, this extraordinary Sultanate mosque came into being, and most probably this modesty yielded not only the ignorance accelerating its decay, but also the lack of interest and visual documentation, making an error-free architectural reconstruction impossible. And we come to the conclusion, and I will conclude with the Islamization of the Catholic land in Galata. Modest or not, an urgent need of a substitution for the humiliating defeats against Catholic countries must have expedited and necessitated the construction of Galata New Mosque, which would make the propaganda of the Ottoman state by supplying self-confidence to its Muslim subjects while annoying the Catholic ones. As Galata was dominantly inhabited by non-Muslims and San Francisco Church was the seat of the Catholic abbot, this infidel space in Istanbul might have become the first target of whipped Ottomans as an exchange for the great territorial loss in Europe. Therefore, Gülnuş Sultan, who was indeed representing the state politics, might have chosen to gain a fast and symbolic victory over the Catholics in the capital, while her son was fighting against their European counterparts in the War of the Holy League. Therefore, it is not a big surprise to see the references of cleaning up of a sinful space to replace it with the house of God in the foundation inscriptions or waqfiyah of the mosque. For the legitimization of this appropriation, the fire that elicited the destruction of the church and building of the mosque was attributed to the will of God, and the argumentation of the ill-mannered and alcohol-selling clergy was used as an excuse. However, San Francisco Church had long played the role of the litmus paper for the Catholic-Ottoman relations and had been barely saved and continued its life after similar crisis up until this final breakpoint. Gülnuş Sultan might have been the real initiator of this appropriation of land, as she was the highest dignitary in the capital, as her son Mustafa II was away for military expedition. This act of hers was also consolidated with the expropriation of the lands around the mosque, owned by non-Muslims, and construction of new houses for the Muslims. Evident in the aforementioned documents, inhabiting Muslims around her mosque was in fact a will of Gülnuş Sultan herself. Hence, all of those facilitated the Islamization of the neighborhood, and Galata, which used to be inhabited by Christians dominantly, and this could be regarded as a conquest of the lands of Catholics, while there was no real conquest of a territory in the war. This appropriation might have been echoed in the building itself as well. With the probable reuse of spolia from San Francisco Church, as it was proposed before construction of the mosque, and repetition of the fact that the site used to be a church in the inscriptions, the act of Islamization should have been intentionally conveyed to both Muslims and non-Muslims. The materials themselves, for instance, the columns once supported San Francisco Church, might have, in a sense, whispered this fact and reminded of the victory over the Catholics. All in all, it's the last slide. All in all, the construction of this unusual Sultanate mosque, the only one built by a Queen Mother in Galata, was the result of a political, economic, and religious conjunctures of the late 17th century Ottoman Empire. Its disappearance also gives invaluable lessons to scholars, not only for the cruciality of the archival materials to revitalize a missing building and its history, but also for the results of ignorance that might cause the loss of an architectural heritage. The mosque, once replaced a Catholic church, could even become the victim itself by being transformed into an irrelevant hardware market such that it could be inconceivable that it once stood there. Thank you very much.